If you like the Lightspeed podcast, then you need to subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter, written by a team including yours truly and delivered to your email inbox daily. Lightspeed is your essential daily briefing on all things Solana. Exclusive news, deep analysis, and the latest trends delivered in a way that's digestible and, I think, sometimes kind of funny. Stay ahead of the curve with the same insights that guide readers from Brevin Howard, Gemini, Jito, CME Group, Solana Labs, and Foundation, and many more. The link to sign up can be found in today's show notes or if you go to blockworks.co. Subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter today. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lightspeed, the place for curiosity-driven conversations about Solana and crypto. I'm your host, Jack Kubanek, and I'm joined today by Leah Wald, the president and CEO of Sol Strategies, which up until about a month ago was known as Cypherpunk Holdings. Leah, thank you so much for joining the show.
Yeah, Jack, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to have you on because, Cypherpunk just rebranded to Sol Strategies, which is a really interesting move and kind of signified this pivot to a more like Solana, the asset, and also the ecosystem focus for the firm. And we're kind of a very Solana-focused podcast, so it made sense there. But I wanted to actually start just with a little bit of your story and also Cypherpunk's story, which is not something I usually do because, tell us your backstory is usually, I read the Bitcoin white paper and there's a lot of sameness there. But I think that your journey, Leah, is a little bit of a microcosm of crypto more recently. I was looking at some of the other podcasts you've been on, and it was a lot of talking about Bitcoin ETFs. Valkyrie was pretty involved in that. But this cycle, post Bitcoin ETFs, there's been a big inflow of liquidity and users into Solana. And it doesn't seem like it's a lot of people who are new to crypto. It seems like a lot of people who have been in crypto, maybe in prior cycles, and are now getting interested in Solana. And I think you're maybe a bit of a microcosm of that. So I just wanted to hear about, I guess, your personal journey into being, pretty into Bitcoin and now pretty fully into Solana, and then also maybe how Cypherpunk ended up there as well.
For me, it was more on the use case of Bitcoin, and I always thought it was going to solve the remittance quarter, and also in the developing countries of being that logical extension with one of the most important pillars of being unconfiscatable, right? And then also just having the pseudo-anonymity, the ledger, all of this is extraordinarily important for the developing world. I think that finally we've gotten to that stage where you see those use cases and the programs that have been developed that actually are taking off. But it did take much longer than I thought it would. So that's actually how I got in. And then how did I make it a full-time career? Finance, like everybody else. You either were a developer or in finance and trading like a crazy person and listening to Scout Bot YouTubers. And I was right there with them. So I started at Lucent Investment Strategies around 2016-17. We were an RIA with my former partner, Tyler Jenks, registered investment advisor. So really started in focusing on investing in GBTC and allocating for our discretionary accounts. That was the only opportunity you had back then. And after that, co-founded Valkyrie and ran it with my former partner, Stephen McClurg. As you mentioned, we launched some of the first Bitcoin ETFs as well as other funds, grantor trusts, hedge funds, et cetera. So a lot of different fund structures, from on-chain, we ran our own validators for some of the other tokens. And then, of course, working with the SEC and finally getting, multiple ETFs approved. As this podcast may be aware, Valkyrie's ETF business was sold to CoinShares in March of this year, the other private funds to Abra Capital Management. And on the back of that, I joined as the CEO of Cypherpunk Holdings. Now, I have been involved, though, as a board member for Cypherpunk Holdings for 3 years, since I believe it was September 2021. So for quite a bit. So aware of, their journey and what's happened there. And also that has led to the pivot that we've made recently. So bringing it back, Cypherpunk Holdings actually was one of the first vehicles whereby they had Bitcoin on the balance sheet back in 2018. They did take the original HODL ticker back in 2018. So I will, take that up with Jan Van Eck a little bit later when I see him next. So they had that original ticker. They put Bitcoin on the balance sheet. They invested in Bitcoin, specifically privacy projects, Samurai, Wasabi, Engrave, etc. That was one of the main thesis. And after that, the thesis of the company became a bit moot when mean people like me launched ETFs. And then recently, when I decided to come on, we discussed with the board what was the next step that we believed would be interesting, prudent, and we were passionate about, and that the market had demand for, and that was Solana, and we went all in. As mentioned, we are all in. In many ways, as you can see from the most recent financial statements, the majority of our book is in Sol. We're running our own validator, and we're actively looking for venture investments in the space. As a holding company, we not only are holding Sol, but specifically need to continue to invest in the space. And I think that's extraordinarily important, and therefore very different from these passive funds that will be launched. Is we are going to continue to invest in the ecosystem and support the ecosystem. And that's part of the thesis of the company.
So you said that the Sol Strategies pivot came because you felt like there was demand for it and like the firm had personal conviction. So can you just maybe walk me through the personal conviction? Like, why are you actually interested in Solana? And then also maybe just some of the market demand you saw as well.
I actually have holds not a huge amount of Sol, but I have held Sol for quite a while. So I've been watching the developments, as had most of the team and the board members. So always personally interested in following the developments, but the transactions being all of the developments that show those nuances on how different Solana is from Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin has beautifully established itself as a wonderfully strong money and hard asset and store value. However, for some of these other use cases, for financial transactions, for tokenization projects, and the necessity for, cheap, fast transactions, I think that Solana is establishing itself. I think that there's major issues with Ethereum at the moment that I think that Solana has done a better job and is continuing to build on. So for the board, for management, and for myself, it not only is an ecosystem and token that we think is underappreciated from a market perspective, but also just a developing and exciting technology that has focused on and created advances that are completely necessary for future use cases that we don't see in other ecosystems.
What is the pitch maybe that you make to clients that you speak with? I mean, like, this is a big rebrand from what you were doing at Valkyrie. It's also different from what Cypherpunk was doing formerly. So like, I'm just curious, how do you explain the value of Solana relative to Bitcoin or Ethereum, which both have more name recognition at the moment?
Yeah, honestly, we see it as a completely different animal that has more potential than Ethereum and the other competitors that we see. Now, again, with Bitcoin, I see it as very different than Solana for their use cases and what they're able to do. And I think that that's perfect. As we continue to evolve as as our own ecosystem of buyers, and not just buyers from the asset perspective, but also buyers from an adoption perspective and joining this ecosystem, it is necessary that we can differentiate between different projects, different tokens, different assets. So if Bitcoin and Solana are seen as completely different things for what they are most valuable and building towards, that is fantastic and extremely important. So for us, beyond Bitcoin, we also see those advances in Solana as being extremely important for the future financial projects.
I was thinking at the top of the show, it's interesting that you kind of mentioned that remittances and global payments were a bit of what got you initially into crypto, because I think that is a way that Bitcoin was thought of near the beginning. And as far as the value proposition now, it's some people are trying to do payments on Bitcoin, but much more it's thought of as maybe this store of value or like a reserve asset that companies can hold or things like that. Whereas there are like Sling Money is an example of, you know, someone who's doing this kind of global Venmo equivalent. And there's lots of the remittances stuff is like Solana is the venue for that. So that fits nicely. That's an interesting piece of your story. So just to, like, before we move on a little bit, as far as the timeline of events, near the beginning of July, you become CEO of what was Cypherpunk at the time and start disclosing that Cypherpunk is acquiring Sol on its balance sheet. At the end of July, you have a shareholder meeting and formally agree on the rebrand to Sol Strategies. And then early September, about a month ago from when we're recording this, is when you announce Sol Strategies. So can you just like walk us through a little bit of the behind the scenes there? How, like, when did the conversations about a pivot to Solana begin, and what kind of went into making that rebrand happen?
Yeah, so it was a logical transition and strategy and roadmap. There's much more elements to the roadmap that I think will be exciting for market participants moving forward. But we did go through that rebrand as well. We wanted the market to understand that this is our focus. Through a variety of avenues, of course, not just, accumulating Sol, not just running a validator and staking it and trying to earn those reoccurring revenues there, but also getting out there. And that's why, I really enjoyed Breakpoint, was by also investing more into the ecosystem, looking for startups that are promising and how else can we support, whether it's by investment dollars or otherwise partnerships, moving forward. So yes, so it started in that clear path, and moving forward, the next iteration and step of this path is what investments would be supporting the ecosystem moving forward.
So something I have been thinking about recently is that Solana is like cool right now in the crypto world. I think Breakpoint was evidence of this, but and lots of projects are sort of adding, like deploying on Solana that maybe initially went to Ethereum. But coolness and like the positive vibes around Solana, obviously it can back it up with things like DeFi volume, and there's like, it's not all just vibes, but there's undeniably this sense in which Solana has become a lot more cool. And I just am curious, like, how do you think internally about what happens if Solana becomes like a boomer blockchain and it's no longer cool and kind of the hip place to build? Are you prepared to weather the storm, or do you think a storm could come in that sense?
Well, I actually think what you're saying is really important on a couple levels. For anyone who's been in, the cryptocurrency industry long enough, they understand that a community lives and dies by their community. So it's a really important note. You have seen different ecosystems and, blockchains literally die when the community developers are no longer interested, whether there's nefarious events that happen or there's just more shiny projects out there that have better optimization, or something more local comes into play, and they like the meetups, and all of that is beautiful and fantastic. So in regards to it being cool, something that was really interesting to me was how much fun everybody had at Breakpoint. And I haven't seen that for a while, and that may sound dumb, but it is important. Everybody seemed to be having a really good time. They seemed very jovial. They seemed very collaborative. They were very excited and optimistic. And these are all extremely important if we want to continue to see developer activity, but also general participant interest. And that's especially true with traditional finance. I do remember this in the earlier days of Bitcoin and building on, we were talking about transaction speeds, Lightning, Liquid, all the, very interesting projects there too. And there still are developers working on that, whether that's the main thesis for Bitcoin or not, you still see that continued effort. So I see similarities of that type of enthusiasm. So I don't think it's going away. What's important, of course, is if we want to take it to traditional finance, You see the initiatives that are being done with Securitize or Franklin Templeton. There's other firms that are looking into other, projects to build. Obviously, real world assets and tokenization projects are of really highest priority that we've seen from an institutional level as per their explicit statements. So if some of those funds are in the future built on Solana, that is very sticky. So even though it may just be fun and exciting right now, if those funds are built and there are LPs, there's investors in that fund, there's a fiduciary responsibility of that manager to continue to oversee that fund. Now, if what they can't do or shouldn't do is say, this is no longer fun, so we're going to close down the fund. They could do that, but hopefully they don't. As long as the fund is still performing in high quality, that investor protections are in place, and there's demand and interest, I hope that they continue to run that fund. I don't think that they're going to be scared if, meme coin frenzy is gone. I think that they're going to be much more interested to see if the transaction speeds are still relatively the same, as well as the fees, and if the blockchain is still able to handle what they need for their fund as the infrastructure rails.
Yeah, makes sense. And good note as well on the real world assets. I think, again, not the sexiest thing, but something that a lot of TradFi folks are really interested in as far as like a future where just lots and lots of things are tokenized. That said, when Sol Strategies launched, I found the story really interesting because I was initially like, what do I even compare this to? Like, it was hard to think of kind of an analogy. So in my article that I did, I called it kind of similar to like a souped up ETF, in the sense that the value prop is you get like a regulated exposure to the price of Solana, plus you get staking yields, plus you get investments in the Solana ecosystem. Daniel Kuhn from The Block, I believe, did a piece as well where he talked about MicroStrategy or like a Bitcoin mining stock. So there's lots of sort of analogies. I guess, is there one that you prefer for what you would compare this to, or is the Sol Strategies thing kind of its own category?
Souped up makes me feel much younger than I am. So, I'll take that any day that I have a souped up strategy. I digress. I think what's important to note is exactly what you said, that there's more under the hood than just trying to amass the asset on the balance sheet. I don't think that's a strong enough thesis moving forward. I think MicroStrategy created a beautiful playbook when Saylor started accumulating, but that's not enough. The underlying operations need to be in correlation and supporting of that asset as well. So in the same way that Bitcoin miners are, securing the network and operating within that network, also typically via investments, as well as holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet, that's more akin to what we're doing. Although as a holding company, we're still able to make even more investments and start diversifying the portfolio, by supporting startups as well. So souped up sounds fun. There are no, real vehicles. There's no ETFs right now in North America. Grayscale has a fund with a 2.5% management fee and wild premiums. So it would be interesting to want to invest in that. However, in regards to any other companies that are solely focused on the Solana ecosystem and adding to the balance sheet, as well as any ETFs, that doesn't currently exist. So I think that we're providing that first opportunity for anyone that's, interested in having a proxy to Sol, while also having a more deep, exposure to Solana as well.
That was also some of my interest in the Sol Strategies pivot. Is something that got me thinking about is you have all of these ETFs. There's like 11 Bitcoin ETFs or something in the US. There's already Canadian ETPs for Solana, and there's just not a lot of differentiation always. And it creates this kind of race to the bottom with fees that we saw with the Bitcoin products. And, Cypherpunk Holdings, in the scale of some of the competitors that are out there, it's a smaller company. And so, is this the type of thing that you need to do to differentiate yourself and compete when so many different venues are offering similar products? Is like, I feel like it's rare to see like, okay, we're going to go all in on just this one ecosystem. But if you can do that niche really well, there's actually a lot of value there. It's similar, weirdly, to what Blockworks is doing in media of like, we are the niche Solana podcast and newsletter. But you can kind of capture that better than the Wall Street Journal, say, which has much better distribution on just crypto news. So a little bit of a digression, but is that sort of the thought here, is like, we're going to pick a niche and we're going to differentiate ourselves from any competitor, even if they have deeper pockets, more clients, things like that?
Yeah, so there are no ETPs in North America at the moment. Canada doesn't have a SOL ETF out yet. So as of right now, we're the only company that's focused on holding it on the balance sheet. So it's really the only option that North American investors have, or Canadian publicly traded, investors have, in order to have that exposure. Again, as mentioned, you have the Grayscale product that's also OTC listed in the United States, but with, we believe, deficiencies. So I think your question is more forward-looking. What happens when the ETFs are approved, whenever that may be? I think that's a rising tide. So I really appreciate when the issuers are able to work with the regulators and actually get those approved. But in the same way that in the United States, you have funds and you have miners, I think that it's really, and you also have MicroStrategy. I think it's really important for investors to have a variety of options, especially when they're differentiated. So again, there's 3iQ is going after a staked SOL ETF in Canada. 21 and VanEck have filed. The 19B4s have been pulled. But their filing is still live, to my understanding, for a SOL ETF as well in the United States. And again, that would be great, because I think it is really important because it's so different. In 2023, so last year, you saw huge inflows, not only to Valkyrie's Bitcoin ETF, but also across the board for Marathon, CleanSpark, et cetera, Canadian ones as well. Wow, the products were out. So you already had Bitcoin ETH blended, you had Bitcoin, you had inverse, you had 2x leverage, you had all these different products. Yet you still saw all the inflows into miners. So for me, that was very interesting. For me, that taught me that the market wants both. They want options, they want a variety, and they see them in a different way. Typically, the United States investors saw the miners as a leveraged play. They saw them as a more picks and shovels exposure play that typically overperformed the underlying asset of Bitcoin held on their balance sheet, and underperformed during bear markets. So it was a very interesting ARB that U.S. investors utilized, especially before Bitcoin ETFs came out. Then after that, registered investment advisors always saw it as the picks and shovels play. And as you may be aware, in the United States, those Bitcoin ETFs, even though they're run by the top shops in the world, are still not on most platforms. So if you go to Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and you ask your wealth manager, or even self-directed, hey, I'd like to buy Valkyrie's old product, or even IBIT, et cetera, you can't, but you can buy miners. And if you talk to registered investment advisors, they'll say, well, I'm used to gold miners. I understand that. So for SOL strategies, by running a validator, by teaching about staking, by teaching about the underlying infrastructure, we're hoping to have that differentiation as well. And talking about that there are picks and shovels in Solana as well, with underlying infrastructure in a different way. And that's great for investors to have two options. So rising tide, in my opinion.
Yeah, good note on the ETPs. In my head, the 3iQ one had been approved, but it's just a filing, I guess, from the summer. It's interesting to say that like Bitcoin mining stocks are sort of a levered play on Bitcoin. Do you see staking in the same light for Solana, or is it a different thing?
I think it could be. I think it's very interesting. And again, if what we're looking at is infrastructure, then why is it any different? Right? Just because you can physically, have the mining, the Bitcoin farms that you can go and check out. And I love doing that. It's still the same backbone infrastructure that's generating rewards. So we see it as akin to Bitcoin mining, yes, for the staking infrastructure.
While we're on the subject of staking, as we mentioned, Sol Strategies runs a validator, I guess, through a third party with about 100,000 Sol staked that you can see on, the validator repository. What's been involved in that? Like, it's you don't see a lot of like holding or investment companies doing Solana staking. So just what's the process been like there?
It was always important for us, and we have quite technical chops. Our CIO is actually Mo Adam, who was a co-founder of BitAccess. Now, for OGs in the space, BitAccess was the largest and one of the first Bitcoin ATMs. So he's overseeing our staking strategy, and it was always important for us to run our own validator. Not only because there's more rewards to be had, and we're able to actually oversee what we're doing, set our own schedules, of course, but also because that ensures and hopefully tells the ecosystem that we're not just here, buying Sol and staking it somewhere. We're actually here trying to be more sophisticated. And we're looking into even more sophisticated strategies at the moment. But yeah, we are running our own validator. Watch for what we're thinking about next.
So with validators, kind of the ball game with that is that your returns go up proportionally to how much Sol you have staked, while your costs stay somewhat fixed for the most part, is my understanding. So to run a profitable validator, the goal is to just get as much stake as possible, accumulated. So what's been kind of the strategy for Sol Strategies so far, trying to accumulate stake and kind of do that profitably? Because I know it can be difficult actually to turn a profit running a validator.
Yeah, as of right now, it is our stake. Admittedly, I put one Sol on there, playing around with the test. But it's our stake on our validator. As of right now, the plan was and is to charge 0%. So you're absolutely right. There's a 0% commission fee, 0% on MEV. And that was in order to have the highest APY that we could. We hope that other individuals and third parties start staking on our validator, but that is not the core focus of our business model. Our core focus as a holding company is by spreading out investments. So for us, we are making revenues, but at the same time charging 6 to 7% commission on inflation schedule and these different things. That has not been the business model. To be determined in the future, but given it's not the business model, we were hoping that also would provide a more benevolent validator in the ecosystem that had those terms set.
Mm-hmm. I'm also just on this topic of staking. I mean, you were obviously working at a US-based firm. Now you're at a Canadian one. And the ETP that we saw from 3iQ included Solana staking rewards, whereas a lot of the Ether ETFs in the US, and also, to my knowledge, the proposed Solana ETFs don't include staking rewards because the SEC has sort of signaled that this runs afoul of securities laws. So has that been a really nice advantage, I guess, of operating in Canada, the fact that you can include staking rewards and yeah.
Yeah, and that's a bigger question. You got to throw in some lawyers here. It's a huge advantage that we are a holding company and it's our own balance sheet. There are very serious suits against Kraken, against Coinbase, against against Consensus, for MetaMask, et cetera, for operating staking as a service, and their staking operations being seen as a securities law violation. and securities transactions. So you're absolutely right. Now, if an asset manager utilizes a custodian that has a internal staking program, where does the onus lie? Likely on that custodial arrangement, and not as much on what they're offering as a product. Now, the question to your point is the regulator going to be comfortable with that? It would be hard to say that the SEC is going to be comfortable providing a staked product when they currently have open suits against other companies for operating a staking business. Now, we may see a new SEC chair with elections coming up. It depends on obviously who is elected and what type of change we see with appointees. So that may change what is focused upon, and also, in what light they will determine down the litigious path or not. But as of right now, highly opaque, and you're absolutely right. There's nerves out there if you're operating a staking service, especially in the United States. However, as a holding company with our own balance sheet and currently set to 0%, being a benevolent staker, we are feeling comfortable with where we're currently sitting legally. And that also, we believe, to your point, provides a huge opportunity for investors to be involved with that by buying our stock as proxy.
I guess to broaden this a little bit too, as far as the competitive dynamics, it seems like we're starting call it like a Solana's institutional investment era, if you will. So far, it's been kind of, more of a niche bet. And I think during this cycle, it's emerged as like one of the big three in crypto, many would say. You've now seen multiple ETF filings, the ETP filing, you've seen Sol strategies. And you're assuming that this continues and you see this kind of like Wall Street institutional type investment apparatus spring up the same way we saw for Bitcoin and then for Ether. What do you think is going to win out? Like, what are going to be the important considerations for that kind of competitive world long term, based on just even what we saw with Bitcoin in the past year?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I like to remind people that initial AUM is not the criteria of success for these products. There's a lot of other elements that go under the hood, spreads, the method of custody, the transactions in the background, how are the market participants trading and interacting, and their comfort levels. Is there concerns around transaction fees? Whatever it may be, and there's a lot of different elements. It's not just how much AUM was garnered day one, especially because a lot of that AUM can actually be artificial. You usually line up seed providers. The question is how much AUM was garnered from organic demand over the year. And I think that'll be interesting to see with the Bitcoin ETFs, and ETH is 9 months post-launch. What are we actually seeing, and is it sticky, and who, has actually funded it? So I think what you're asking is a tough question to answer. I think it comes down to, though, less on let's, see who is more competitive, Bitcoin, Ether, Sol, when these products are launched. I think it's each one should be seen under a different microscope. And see if, the blockchain's actually handled everything appropriately, as well as investor sentiment. There's a lot of, concerns around Ethereum right now. So we'll see if they continue to see flows, those products. What happens with Bitcoin? I think we'll continue to see flows as more of a flagship. But, to be determined, and maybe Sol wins out. But yes, to your point, what may eventually winning is a staked product. Again, you see those in Europe for quite a while now, and they've done really well. But I would make sure and caution investors and people to not just look at the total AUM as the the success metric. That's not it. Especially, it needs to be taken into consideration against the relative size of that blockchain. Solana being different than Bitcoin and different than Ethereum. So that is totally fine and that's great. But we need to also take that into consideration that it's maybe more notional success than, just, this has 100 million and this has 50. So time will tell.
Yeah, it's always just been an interesting question to me with sort of crypto specific ETFs and funds, because they're so similar in a lot of ways. Like there's a very obvious difference between the kind of bet you're making if you invest in, say, Bitcoin versus Ethereum. But if you invest in the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF versus the Valkyrie CoinShares one, I'm sure there are differences, but it's like less clear to me. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how all of that unfolds. I think the place I want to end on is, you talked about, one of the benefits of being a holding company is you can not only buy the asset and get staking rewards, but you can also make sort of bets within the Solana ecosystem. We're always, interviewing, talking to people, thinking about sort of the projects and things being built within Solana. So I just wanted to ask, like, what types of companies or sectors within the Solana ecosystem are you particularly bullish on?
Particularly interested in infrastructure tooling. So there's a lot that's being done, obviously, in the staking industry with a lot of different companies vying in that industry. But I think that there's particularly interesting tools that are also being created. Looking at everything that's being built, it's still a smaller group of builders right now. So I think it's possible to talk to a lot of them. So watching all those developments, there were some fun games if you were a Breakpoint to play with. But especially infrastructure has always been a important industry or vertical in pretty much any blockchain that I've ever looked at to invest in. So that's really where we're focusing our time, infrastructure tools.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, that is sadly all the time we have for today, because I have to go jump on a plane to Permissionless, where I hope to see some Lightspeed listeners. But Leah, it's been a really interesting conversation, and it's been fun getting to dive more deeply into what I think is a really interesting story in the Solana world. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and fly safely.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Take care, everyone.